obviously am a huge fan of Kaladesh. I'm very proud of what we made. And one of the neat things about making a world as special as Kaladesh is finding a way to build upon it, to make a set that sort of, follows up the awesomeness that's Kaladesh, but gives something new and different to it. And I think that one of the neat things about Aether Revolt is it both followed Kaladesh, plays with Kaladesh, does neat things, but it's its own set. Like, you're in for a wild ride. Like, you've met the calm Kaladesh, let's meet the wild Kaladesh.
Magic is a game about conflict. It's a fighting game, ultimately. There's combat. So Kaladesh presented a unique and difficult challenge in that there wasn't any kind of all-out war. A lot of our sets are about war, or about fighting. And so it was kind of refreshing to get back to a conflict that we could represent with people fighting each other, and we could actually show that in the cards.
So Revolt came from us looking for a way to give the player an additional benefit from having their stuff broken or losing things, and specifically making it leaves the battlefield instead of goes to the graveyard or dies, was intended to sort of embrace the spirit of the block of being open-ended and letting you combine things together. There's some self-bounce in the block where you can bounce your own creatures, blinking where you can exile it and bring it back into play, or sacrificing creatures or sacrificing artifacts are all ways to get Revolt to work. And so it plays sort of a multi-purpose role as recycling your broken inventions into additional power, or sort of a vengeance theme of you killed my creature and now this next creature I play is more powerful.
Revolt has interesting gameplay implications. A lot of times you'll see either iffy attacks or downright horrible attacks. You can see that as a defender, you're seeing oh wow, they probably want to get Revolt. If I kill this stuff, they might get Revolt. I really don't want their Lifecraft Cavalry to be a 6/6. It'd be a lot easier for me to deal with as a 4/4. So that really factors in. Combat's a lot more interesting, so super obvious plays may not be so obvious. Or they could just be bad attacks, because we're all prone to making those.
Vengeful Rebel is a card that works particularly well with Revolt in combat. So bluffing, attacking smaller creatures into larger creatures. When you throw Vengeful Rebel into the mix, your opponent has to start thinking about, well, if they block your 1/1 with their 4/4, it might not be that you play a 2/2 that gets more powerful. You might also have this Rebel that can finish their creature off, and having a card that sort of turns into a removal spell if you have Revolt on gives a lot more play to how Revolt needs to be evaluated in combat.
In Constructed, when you're building a deck around Revolt, you're really going to want to make sure that you hit it every time. A card like Unbridled Growth played on turn 1 may not look very threatening, but then on turn 2, when you sacrifice it and play Greenwheel Liberator for a 2-mana 4/3, your opponent's going to be pretty scared.
Fatal Push is a bit of an experiment for us. What if the strongest removal spells are black? Black is known as a removal color, but if you look at what are the strongest removal spells in Magic, Lightning Bolt and Sword Splashes. Fatal Push is our attempt at, what if it's black? In Standard, you have a lot of cheap ways to get rid of something, but in Eternal formats, you get the fetch lands, and that's the biggest deal. So oftentimes, Fatal Push is B, instant, destroy target creature CMC 4 or less. And that's a really big game changer.
One of the things that we definitely wanted to play up in Kaladesh, and that we didn't quite get completely in the original set, was the idea of making things, of having an artifact mechanic that represented making artifacts, designing things. And that one of the things we wanted to do was, in Aether Revolt, they're having a revolt, but they are making things. One of the neat things about this is that the rebels are designing their own weapons, designing their own tools. That part of this revolution is that they are using their skills as craftsmen, as artisans, to do something. And we wanted to get that sense in our mechanics. And so one of the cool things about Improvise was it really got the sense of making something. That yes, there's destruction, but there's also creation.
So one thing that we discussed a lot as we were working on Kaladesh was whether we wanted to have any explicit artifact mechanic in Kaladesh. So what we ended up with was there are a lot of cards that say if you control an artifact or that key off artifacts in some way, but there's no keyword, there's no word that means these cards are good with artifacts except the abilities that we designed in Kaladesh. And we knew pretty early that when we decided to go that direction with Kaladesh, that with Aether Revolt we were going to want to pay off that artifact mechanic. Give people a keyword that specifically meant this card is good with artifacts, and Improvise being a cost reduction mechanic, which also doesn't really exist in other places in the block. Just felt like a pretty natural fit to put there.
So coming out of Kaladesh Standard, we saw a lot of the artifact stuff was working, especially the aggressive strategies. So one of the things we wanted to make sure happened was to have artifact-based decks that were working on a different axis. Cards like Tezzeret and a lot of the improvised cards are for a slower, more controlling artifact deck.
So the implements are there as sort of a crossover cycle between many things that the block is doing. So there are artifacts that are relatively inexpensive to put onto the battlefield that'll count for your cards that are checking if you have an artifact. They can also sit there and be tapped to reduce cost for Improvise. And then finally you can sacrifice them to have a permanent leave the battlefield that turn to enable your Revolt cards. So individually their effects are pretty marginal, but they're the glue that ties a lot of the mechanical elements of the set together.
In the first set, when we introduce something, we really want to do it in the simplest form possible. And vehicles are complicated. I mean, vehicles are definitely were the most complicated thing we had done in Kaladesh. And so we introduced them. And one of the neat things about the second set is, okay, we've introduced the things. We don't have to explain that part to you, and we can tweak a little bit. So you will see us playing around with vehicles and doing a few different things than we did in the first set.
Peace Walker Colossus is a card that really lets you fill your deck up with vehicles. Normally, you might not want to have that many because of the risk of having too many which clog up your hand. But if you have Peace Walker Colossus on the board, then you can be sure they'll all be crewed.
Aether Revolt continues the energy theme from Kaladesh. So a lot of the cards from Kaladesh that generate or spend energy, you're going to want to sort of take a second look at, because now there's all these additional ways to generate or spend energy that might create new combinations or new decks that weren't there before, because maybe you didn't quite have a good enough way to spend your energy in a red-black deck, for example, but now we're introducing more cards that use energy in both those colors, so revisiting that, could prove to create new decks in that area.
From a design perspective, one of the liberating things about the new two-set block model that we're working in is that we can cherry pick. We can express in our two sets only the best of what this world has to offer. Only the elements that we think, well, this is really worth it to put in this set. We don't have to spread ourselves too thin. We don't have to show everything here. We just show the best stuff, the most awesome stuff. If it really hits, if it clicks with the public, if there's a clamor to come back, we'll come back later. We'll find more design space. But for now, this is the best stuff.